Hey everyone, and welcome back to Fine Print. Today, we're going to be going over the APUSH Unit 4 episode for the APUSH Review Series. We'll be starting off with 4.2, The Rise of Political Parties and the Era of Thomas Jefferson. In the election of 1800, the Federalists had lost popularity because of John Adams' presidency. The Alien and Sedition Acts were unfavored. There were high taxes, and there was a strong navy, which was opposed by the Democratic Republicans. The Federalists supported a strong national government and sided with Great Britain, but the Democratic Republicans supported states' rights and sided with France, and both sides supported tariffs. Northerners wanted higher tariffs to protect American industries, but Southerners wanted lower tariffs to encourage their own trade. Thomas Jefferson and Burr tied for the presidency, but Thomas Jefferson eventually gained a majority and became the president. This election was also termed the Revolution of 1800 because the Federalists accepted their defeat peacefully and there was no bloodshed in the transfer of power. During Jefferson's presidency, he tried to win the trust of the Federalists by maintaining the national bank and the concept of neutrality, but he also reduced the military size, taxes, and the national debt. The Louisiana Purchase was when Napoleon Bonaparte forced Spain to give the Louisiana Territory back to France. It increased the size of the United States and gave them the right to explore the new lands, but also was termed as unconstitutional because the Constitution didn't allow the federal government to buy foreign land. The Federalists criticized its unconstitutionality, but the Democratic-Republican majority ratified the purchase in Senate. Thomas Jefferson also suspended the Alien and Sedition Acts and supported a campaign of impeachment to remove Federalists suspected of bias and partisan. If you were suspected, you could be impeached. It largely failed, but made the judges more cautious. Jefferson won the re-election in 1804 by an overwhelming margin, but he also faced more challenges during his second term. He faced a plot by former Vice President Aaron Burr, and the Democratic-Republican Party split. The Quids accused Jefferson of abandoning Democratic-Republican ideals and had trouble with Napoleonic Wars. After Aaron Burr wasn't nominated again for vice president, he threatened to break up the Union. He first became the governor of New York and then united with other New England states. His plan was to then secede from the United States. Most Federalists opposed, but Burr lost the New York election. After facing an insulting comment, Burr challenged Hamilton to a duel and fatally shot Hamilton. The Federalists now developed an increased anger towards the Democratic Republicans and Aaron Burr because of the loss of possibly their greatest leader, Alexander Hamilton. The judicial system also saw increased changes in its own systems. First was Chief Justice John Marshall. He consistently supported federalism and increasingly gained support because people believed that the Constitution had benefited the people. In the court case Marbury v. Madison, he established the system of judicial review. John Adams had made last-minute appointments of Federalists as judges before his end of his term, and Jefferson wanted to block these appointments. Thus, he ordered Madison to deliver a commission. Marbury sued, and Marshall said that Marbury had the right to sue under the Judiciary Acts of 1789, but said that the act gave court too much power and thus established judicial review, where the Supreme Court could declare the constitutionality of a law. In the election of 1808, Thomas Jefferson voluntarily retired from the presidency and supported his best friend James Madison. James Madison was a good thinker, but was poor at political speaking. However, because of Jefferson's assistance, he was able to get nominated for the presidency, and then won majority votes in both the Congress and the House of Representatives. 4.3 covers politics and regional interests. The Era of Good Feelings was a title given to the time period of James Monroe's presidency. There was a spirit of nationalism and goodwill, but eventually there were debates over tariffs, the national bank, internal improvements, and public land sales. James Monroe was an ex-revolutionary who won an overwhelming support in the Electoral College. He represented the growing nationalism through acquisition of Florida, the Missouri Compromise, and the Monroe Doctrine. When it came to economic nationalism, the Tariff of 1816 was when Congress levied low tariffs on imports. American manufacturers were now scared because their businesses were at a threat. Thus, Congress raised tariffs to protect these American industries, also known as a protective tariff. The North opposed this because of limited manufacturing, but the South and the West supported this. The Second Bank of the United States was also chartered by Congress under James Madison's presidency. Henry Clay also proposed an economic American system. There were three main plans with benefits for both the East and the West. First were protective tariffs. These would promote American manufacturing, and the beneficiaries were Eastern manufacturers. Second was the National Bank. Its purpose was to ensure a smooth economy with national currency. And third were internal improvements. Increased tariffs would allow more roads and canals, benefiting the South and the West. In this American system, the third point, internal improvements, were vetoed, but the National Bank and protective tariffs were passed by Congress. Then came the Panic of 1819. The Second Bank of the United States tightened credit control inflation. State banks closed, unemployment increased, bankruptcies were common, and imprisonment for debt also increased. It hit the West the hardest, and nationalist beliefs were shaken. The Federalist Party declined rapidly because it failed to progress with society. The Democratic-Republican Party faced internal strains. Some clung to old beliefs, but others modified the party's beliefs to become slightly more federal. During this time period, America was also moving further westward, and had many reasons to do so. First was the acquisition of new lands. Military victories increased land control and opened new territories to white settlers. Second were economic pressures. Economic difficulties led New Englanders to move to the West for fresh opportunities. Next was improved transportation, which allowed mass migration, and European immigrants increased the need for land in the United States. There were also many concerns about moving westward. Cheap money from state banks, low prices for federally sold land, and improved transportation were all concepts that the Westerners disagreed with, as well as slavery, because the Southerners wanted slavery and the Northerners didn't. Henry Clay rises up again during the Missouri Compromise during this time period. The United States wanted to admit Missouri as a state. However, if it did become a state, it would become a slave state, which would tip control towards the South and not maintain a balance between slave and free states in America. The Tallmadge Amendment is proposed. Missouri had to apply for statehood as a free state. The South opposed this in Senate because if this was done, then the benefits would tip in favor of the North, which would also disrupt balance. Henry Clay then proposes the Missouri Compromise. If Missouri was admitted as a slave state, Maine would be admitted as a free state to ensure an equal balance between slave and free states in the America. Sectional feeling subsided, but people were torn between nationalism and sectionalism. 4.4 discusses America on the world stage. Jefferson tried to avoid war and maintain neutrality, but was challenged by foreign issues. Barbaric pirates seized American ships in Africa. Jefferson gets upset and sends a small U.S. Navy to protect these ships on African coasts. This gains respect for a growing America. The Napoleonic Wars in Europe shaped the economy of the United States. Britain impressed U.S. sailors, which angered Americans, but Jefferson refused to conduct war against the British. The British warship Leopold also fired on the American warship Chesapeake, which angered Americans, but Jefferson once again refused to war. The Embargo Act was when Jefferson said that the United States could not trade with any foreign countries. He wanted Britain to struggle economically, but it backfired on the American economy itself. The New England merchants are upset and threaten to secede from the Union. First in James Madison's foreign policy is the Non-Intercourse Act. James Madison hoped to end economic hardships for America and stated that the United States would now trade with all nations besides Britain and France. Macon's bill was when Macon, an individual from Congress, said that the United States could trade with Britain and France, and if either country promised to stop showing aggression, the United States would stop trade with their enemy. Napoleon agreed to this, and the United States began trade with France. However, Napoleon had actually lied and still impressed U.S. sailors. In 1812, the United States gets entangled in the War of 1812. The imminent causes of the war was British impressment of U.S. sailors, conflict with Native Americans, and war hawks demanding war to defend American honor. By the time Congress declared war, Britain had in fact agreed to stop impressing their sailors, but the message was delivered too late. New England merchants, Federalist politicians, anti-war Democratic Republicans, and Quids, who were conservatives, were all critics of the war. The United States achieved some naval victories due to superior shipbuilding and the contributions of African Americans. The British Army invaded Washington, D.C., and burnt the Capitol and the White House, but Fort Henry held up against the bombardment, which is where the Star-Spangled Banner was written by Francis Scott Key. Andrew Jackson became a war hero in this war for his heroic victories in the Battle of Horseshoe Bend at New Orleans. The Treaty of Ghent formally ended the war. Britain was tired and America knew they couldn't defeat Britain, thus they signed a peace treaty and pre-war boundaries were maintained. The Hartford Convention was where radical New Englanders met and threatened to secede from the Union. Delegates from New England rejected the idea but asked for proposals to Democratic Republican power. When they went to the White House with these proposals, the news of Southern victory reached, overshadowing these proposals. The War of 1812 had a lasting legacy on American nationalism. The United States gained respect of foreign nations. They also accepted Canada as British land. The Federalist Party came to an end and were named unpatriotic because of what had happened at the Hartford Convention. Secession talks in the North set an example for the South for the Civil War. American Indians were forced to surrender, and feelings of nationalism grew stronger as America moved towards industrial self-sufficiency. During James Monroe's presidency, the United States took a more aggressive and nationalistic approach to foreign relations. However, they still maintained peace. Agreements with Britain and Canada were conducted over borders and economic rights. As Spain moved its forces out of Florida to focus on South American rebellions, Americans pushed in. Thus, Spain ceded Florida in exchange for the U.S. to give up claims of Texas. This treaty was known as the James-Onis Treaty. Russian presence in Alaska worried Britain and the United States, who had a common goal of restricting foreign influence. The Monroe Doctrine was a declaration by James Monroe of a U.S. policy towards Europe and Latin America that warned them of U.S. disapproval of colonization in the Western Hemisphere. Britain adhered to these requirements, and the Americans applauded James Monroe, but the doctrine didn't hold much significance until later. The Old Northwest consisted of 6 territories that became states under the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. They were mostly unsettled, but the settled part relied on Mississippi to transport grain to southern markets and ports. It soon became closely tied to northern states due to increased canals and railroads and the further westward movement of natives. Corn and wheat were profitable, and the steel plow and the mechanical reaper increased efficiency. Roads connected most of America's major cities. The National Road, also known as the Cumberland Road, served as a major route to the west. The Erie Canal linked western farms to eastern cities, stimulated economic growth, lowered food prices in the east, increased immigration to the west, and encouraged stronger economic ties between the east and the west. The steam engines revolutionized the location of factories, and steamboats made trips faster and cheaper. Railroads competed directly with canals as an alternate transportation method. Telegraphs transmitted messages across long distances almost instantly, easier to give orders to large troops miles away for the military. Interchangeable parts allowed for mass production of goods that could easily get replaced with new parts. Changes in state corporation laws facilitated raising large sums of money that spurred development. The factory system stimulated domestic manufacturing and helped new factories prosper. Textile mills recruited young women and children that led to increased employment, and labor unions were organized to protest long hours, low pay, and poor working conditions. Farming became more commercialized, and farmers switched to cash crops. The cotton gin spurred the South's agricultural economy. Southern planters found cotton more profitable than other cash crops and invested capital in purchasing slaves, which connected the South with the global cotton economy. 4.6 covers the effects of the market revolution on society and culture. Women seeking employment had two choices, either domestic service or teaching, because factory jobs were uncommon. Women were gaining more control over their lives across America, and the amount of children per family decreased. Wages improved, but there was a large gap between the wealthy and the poor. The population growth was spurred by a high birth rate, increased immigration, and an increase in the non-white population because of the increase of slaves in the South. The sudden increase in European immigrants was due to inexpensive and rapid transportation across the Atlantic Ocean, the struggles in Europe that drove people out, and the growing reputation of the United States as a country with opportunities and freedom. This increase in immigration led to crowded housing, poor sanitation, diseases, and high crime rates, which became common in working-class areas. As manufacturing increased, goods became less expensive. The standard of living improved for those who could afford them. Urban workers in different cities organized unions and local political parties to protect their interests. Improvement for workers was limited by periodic depressions, hostile employers, and an abundance of inexpensive labor. 4.7 covers an expanding democracy. Men and women, and rich and poor sat together, and equality was becoming America's governing principle, however, only for whites. Politics moved out of rich white homes and became more open to middle and lower class families. Male suffrage was a concept where voting rights were expanded to all white men, even those without property. States began allowing voters to choose presidential electors instead of the state's legislatures. Third parties were also created for workers' rights to go against Masons. During the Jacksonian era, voters got more recognition in government and increased their interest in voting. Campaigns were directed directly to the interests and prejudices of the common people and became a form of local entertainment. During Jackson's presidency, he fired any office holder who wasn't a Democratic, which was also known as the spoils system. The concept of rotation in office limited a person to one term in office. Jackson then appointed a deserving Democrat in his place. 4.8 discusses Jackson and federal power. Adams, Clay, Crawford, and Jackson were all running for the presidency. Henry Clay used his political influence to get Samuel Adams more votes, and in return, Adams appointed Clay as his Secretary of State. Andrew Jackson and his supporters called it a corrupt bargain. Adams asked Congress for money, and Jacksonians viewed this as a waste of money and a violation of the Constitution. Congress's new tariff law further supported the North over the South. Jacksonians resorted to accusations to win Jackson the presidency. They accused Adams' wife, and Adams' supporters accused Jackson's wife of adultery. Jackson ultimately won the election, but mainly because of his reputation as a war hero. Jackson became a symbol for the working class and gained fame as an Indian fighter and war hero. He fought several duels, had a violent temper, and didn't have a college education. He also opposed federal spending and national debt. During Jackson's presidency, he signed the controversial Indian Removal Act of 1830, which forced the resettlement of thousands of natives on a route called the Trail of Tears. In the court case Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, it stated that Cherokees couldn't sue in a federal court. Worcester versus Georgia ruled that Georgian laws had no force within Cherokee territory. Jackson sided with the states, and Congress was powerless without his support. Jackson favored states' rights and declared the Tariff of Abominations unconstitutional. John C. Calhoun's nullification theory stated that each state had the right to obey a federal law or to declare it null and disobey it. In the Webster-Hayne debate, conflicting views of the nature of the federal union under the Constitution, Calhoun in South Carolina nullified federal tariffs. Andrew Jackson issued a proclamation to the people of the South Carolina, stating that nullification and disunion were treason. Federal troops didn't agree with Jackson, and Andrew Jackson compromised by suggesting that Congress lower tariffs. Jackson suppressed the growing anti-slavery movement in the North with his executive power. Southern Jacksonians trusted that he wouldn't extend democracy to African Americans. Furthermore, Andrew Jackson found the National Bank of the United States unconstitutional. However, Henry Clay favored the bank and persuaded the majority in Congress, but without Jackson, they vetoed the law and won re-election. During Jackson's second term, his supporters were known as Democrats, and supporters of Henry Clay were called Whigs, who supported spending federal money for internal improvements. Both parties were challenged to respond to westward expansion of the nation and the industrial economy. Jackson withdrew federal funds and transferred them to state banks, which were also known as pet banks. Specie circular required that all purchases of federal lands be made in specie, gold or silver, rather than paper notes. Banknotes lost value, and land sales plummeted. In the Panic of 1837, once Jackson left office, the nation's economy plunged into an economic depression. Andrew Jackson didn't seek a third term and persuaded the Democratic Party to nominate Van Buren as the next president. The Whigs attempted to nominate 3 candidates from 3 different regions, but the strategy failed and Van Buren won. As soon as Van Buren took office, the country suffered a financial panic, largely due to Jackson's criticism of the Bank of the United States. The Whigs were in a strong position to defeat Van Buren. They were more organized and nominated war hero William Henry Harrison. Harrison won and established the Whigs as a national party. After Harrison's death, he was succeeded by his vice president John Tyler, who wasn't very Whig-like. He vetoed national bank bills and favored the North and the Northeast, contrary to what the Whigs had previously believed in. During this time, the concept of the Western frontier also grew in America. The definition of the West kept changing. By the mid-1800s, it lay beyond the Mississippi all the way to California and Oregon. Natives were driven westward as white settlers moved in, and Spanish horses allowed native tribes to migrate easily and defend their land by force. The West represented the possibility of a fresh start and as a place of greater freedom for all ethnicities. White settlers in the western frontier worked hard from sunrise to sunset, and shelters were built from natural resources, but diseases and malnutrition were threats. Women performed all daily tasks, but isolation, endless work, and childbirth led women to have a shorter lifespan. Most settlers were unaware of the environmental damage that they were causing as well. 4.9 covers the development of an American culture. The younger generation was riled up about Western expansion and believed that the young country was entering an era of unlimited prosperity. Nationalism was also spread through art and literature. Romanticism was a movement towards intuition, feelings, and heroism, most expressed by transcendentalists. Transcendentalists argued for an intuitive way of thinking and believed artistic expression was important. They valued individualism and supported many reforms. 2 notable individuals, mainly transcendentalists, emerged during this time period. Ralph Waldo Emerson expressed individualism and nationalism and urged the creation of an American culture, self-reliance, independent thinking, and became a critic of slavery and supported the Union in the Civil War. Henry David Thoreau was a remembered ecologist and conservationist and felt that the United States and Mexico War was immoral. He refused to pay taxes and got arrested, and his book inspired Gandhi and Martin Luther King in their own non-violent protests. Brook Farm was a community that emphasized a utopian society. The goal was to achieve a natural union between intellectual and manual labor. Many reformers lived on the farm, but fire and debts forced the end of the remembered experiment. Paintings often portrayed the life of ordinary people, and architecture was inspired by the democracy of Athens. The literature during the time period was romantic and distinctively American as well. 4.10 discusses the Second Great Awakening. There was a growing emphasis on democracy and a movement towards more emotional expressions. People believed that industrialization led to increased greed and sin, and looked for worship settings outside formal churches. Successful young preachers were audience-centered and were easily understood by the uneducated. They spoke about salvation for all and appealed to people's emotions. Many people believed that the world was going to end with the second coming of Jesus. People traced a connection between the natives and Israel's lost tribes, and some people migrated to escape resentment. The Second Great Awakening included efforts to reduce drinking or temperance, end slavery, and provide better treatment for the mentally ill, as done by Dorothea Dix. 4.11 covers an age of reform. The antebellum period was a period between the Jacksonian era and the Civil War that saw many historic reform movements. free public schools, improved treatment of the mentally ill, gender equality, abolishing slavery, and ending alcohol addiction. This was caused by Enlightenment beliefs and an emphasis on democracy, Puritanism, and more. A high rate of alcohol consumption became tied to crime, poverty, and sexual harassment. The American Temperance Society persuaded drinkers to take a pledge of total abstinence. A group of recovering alcoholics formed the Washingtonians and argued that alcoholism was a disease. Immigrants opposed the movement but had no power, and slavery overshadowed this temperance movement, but it regained strength and eventually became an amendment. An increasing number of criminals and mentally ill people led various reformers to demand improved treatment. Dorothea Dix and mental hospitals, special institutions for people with physical disabilities, and prisons with more disciplined routines rose during this time period. Furthermore, reformers advocated for free public schools for all classes, longer years, mandatory attendance with teaching moral principles, and growing private colleges in America. Family roles also changed during this time period. Birth rates declined as economic value of children decreased. Moral reform societies helped women avoid being forced into prostitution. The cult of domesticity was a concept where women began taking charge of the household and children. Female reformers resented males viewing females as secondary and spoke out for women's rights. At the Seneca Falls Convention, leading feminists met and issued the Declaration of Sentiments. It declared all men and women equal and listed women's grievances against discriminatory laws. Many campaigns erupted, but this movement was soon overshadowed by the slavery crisis. The anti-slavery movement also rose in popularity during this time period. The Second Great Awakening led many Christians to view slavery as a sin. The American Colonization Society tried the idea of transporting freedmen to an African colony and established an African American settlement in Liberia. However, it wasn't effective. Garrison published The Liberator. It was an anti-slavery newspaper and condemned the Constitution as a pro-slavery document. However, his radicalism led to a split in the abolition movement. The Liberty Party was a group of Northerners who believed that political action was more practical than radicalism. Freedmen began speaking out against slavery. For example, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth. Some Northern African Americans advocated for extreme radicalism. They argued that slaves should revolt against their owners. Nat Turner led a revolt where 55 whites died. Whites then killed hundreds of African Americans and ended the rebellion. 4.12 discusses African Americans in the early republic. In the North, there weren't many African Americans, but they were able to maintain their own families, but were denied the same equality as whites. In the South, emancipated African Americans weren't granted the same equality as whites. Some were freed during the Revolution, and others through self-purchase. All slaves were deprived of their freedom. Families were separated, and females were exposed to sexual exploitation. Despite this, African Americans maintained a strong sense of family and religion. Escaping hunters were paid a bounty for captured slaves, and the Underground Railroad gained popularity. Southerners resisted political and diplomatic interactions with Haiti after the Haitian Revolution, and slaves were inspired by readings from the Bible. Rebellions gave slaves hope of freedom, but slave codes became stricter. 4.13 discusses Southern society in the early republic. Eli Whitney's cotton gin made cotton affordable, and cotton production moved westward and increased slavery. Some whites justified slavery as an economic necessity, and soon people justified that slavery was good for the slave and the master. The South focused on agriculture and focused capital investment on slavery, so they couldn't undertake industrialization as heavy as the North. White society had been split up by many economic and social groups. At the top were the aristocracy, the South's small elite of wealthy planters who dominated Southern politics. Next were farmers, who produced the bulk of cotton crop, and lived modestly as farmers, who worked alongside African Americans. Next were poor whites, who couldn't afford rich farmland. Lastly were the mountain people. They lived in frontiers, were isolated from the South, and disliked planters and slavery. The South was an agricultural region with few large commercial cities. They were defensive about slavery, were mostly feudal with a code of chivalry, and churches saw a decline in anti-slavery organizations. They wanted to educate the higher classes, but slaves were prohibited from education. And they also viewed the antebellum reforms as a threat to the Southern way of life.